The barrel of the Winchester leveled straight at the man's chest, the steel cold against the humid tension of the saloon. The entire town of Bitter Creek held its breath. They had told the woman he was a monster. They had whispered that Barrett Coulter buried his conscience along with his victims in the high timber. But as the town's corrupt sheriff took a step toward the trembling bride, reaching for her arm with a sneer, the massive mountain man didn't flinch. The sheriff laughed, asking if the beast was finally going to kill someone. Barrett's voice dropped, rumbling like an avalanche. "Only if you hurt her." And in that moment, the town realized the devil wasn't the man on the mountain. It was the law standing right in front of them. October 14th, 1883. The date was stamped clearly on the ticket Lorna Hayes clutched in her gloved hand, the ink smudged by the sweat of her anxiety. The Northern Pacific Railway steam engine hissed and groaned as it lurched to a halt, spewing a grey cloud of coal smoke over the wooden platform of Bitter Creek, Montana Territory. Lorna didn't move immediately. She sat on the hard wooden bench of the third-class carriage, smoothing the wrinkles of her only respectable grey dress. She was 24 years old, penniless, and fleeing a life in Boston that had promised her nothing but a debtor's prison or a forced marriage to a man 3 times her age. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had been brief, almost curt. Wanted, wife, capable of hard work, mountain living, solitude, right to be Coulter. She had written. He had sent a ticket. No love letters, no poetry, just a ticket and a time. Stepping onto the platform, the bite of the autumn wind hit her instantly. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town, just a muddy thoroughfare lined with weather-beaten false-front buildings, a saloon that smelled of stale beer even from here, and a general store with peeling paint. "You the package for Coulter?" Lorna jumped, turning to see a man leaning against a support post. He was wearing a tin star pinned to a greasy vest. Sheriff Brody. He had a face like a dried apple and eyes that roved over her with unsettling familiarity. "I am Lorna Hayes," she said, her voice trembling but her chin high. "I am here to meet Mr. Barrett Coulter." The sheriff chuckled, a wet, hacking sound. He pushed off the post and walked a slow circle around her. "Mr. Coulter, that's a polite way of putting it. Around here, we just call him the beast of the bighorns. You sure you didn't get on the wrong train, sweetheart?" "I'm quite sure," Lorna replied, gripping her carpetbag tighter. "Is he here?" "Oh, he's here. He don't come down often. Usually only when he needs supplies or fresh meat." Brody stopped in front of her, leaning in close. "Listen to me, girl. You look like a lady. Soft hands. Pretty face. You don't belong up there with him." "Coulter, he ain't right. There's a reason he lives above the snow line. 2 years ago, a prospector went up that mountain looking for gold. Never came down. They say Coulter uses the bones for his fences." Lorna felt the blood drain from her face. "That is just gossip." "Is it?" A woman's voice chimed in. Lorna turned to see a severe-looking woman in a high-collared black dress stepping out of the general store. This was Mrs. Higgins, the town gossip and moral arbiter. "Sheriff's right, dear. We tried to warn the last one." "The last one?" Lorna whispered. "Didn't tell you, did he?" Mrs. Higgins tutted, shaking her head. "You ain't the first bride he sent for. The other one took one look at him, screamed, and got back on the train. But you, the train's leaving in 5 minutes. If I were you, I'd be on it." Lorna looked back at the train. The conductor was already signaling the final boarding. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If she went back to Rupert Grimsby, the lone shark who had threatened to burn her father's apothecary if she didn't pay his debts in trade. She looked at the sheriff, then at the harsh mountains looming in the distance, their peaks shrouded in ominous grey clouds. "I have made a promise," Lorna said, though her voice was barely a whisper. "I will stay." Sheriff Brody spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the platform, narrowly missing the hem of her dress. "Suit yourself. But when the snows lock you in up there, don't expect us to come running when you scream. He's dangerous, girl. He's got a graveyard in his eyes." Just then, the atmosphere on the platform shifted. The chatter of the few townsfolk died out instantly. Even the horses hitched to the rail seemed to nervous, stamping their hooves. A man was walking up the mud-slicked street from the livery stable. He was massive. That was the only word for him. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He wore a heavy coat made of bear fur, the hide scarred and worn. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but as he stepped onto the wooden planks of the platform, the light caught his jaw. A thick, jagged scar ran from his left temple, cutting through his eyebrow and down across his cheek, disappearing into a dark, unkempt beard. He moved with a predatory grace, silent and heavy. Barrett Coulter. He stopped 3 feet from her. The air smelled of pine resin, wood smoke and old leather. He didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at Mrs. Higgins. He looked only at Lorna. His eyes were the color of flint, hard, cold, and unreadable. "You, Lorna?" His voice was a deep gravel rasp, as if he hadn't spoken in weeks. "Yes," she squeaked, then cleared her throat. "Yes, Mr. Coulter." He looked her up and down, not with lust, but with a critical, assessing gaze. He saw the thin grey coat, the shivering hands, the fear in her eyes. "You're small," he grunted. "I am stronger than I look," she countered, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest despite the terror. He stared at her for a long second, and for a moment Lorna thought she saw something flicker in those flinty eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or disappointment? Without another word, he reached out. Lorna flinched, expecting a blow. The sheriff snickered, but Barrett simply grabbed her heavy carpet bag as if it weighed nothing. "Wagons this way," he said, turning his back on the town. "We beat the storm if we ride now." He didn't offer his arm. He didn't smile. He just walked away, expecting her to follow. Lorna looked at the sheriff, who was watching her with a dark, predatory grin, implying she had just made a fatal mistake. She took a deep breath, gathered her skirts, and followed the giant into the mud. The wagon ride was a torture Lorna had not anticipated. It was a buckboard wagon, sturdy and functional, pulled by 2 massive black draft horses that looked as ill-tempered as their master. Lorna sat on the hard wooden bench, clutching the side rail until her knuckles turned white. They left Bitter Creek behind, the sounds of civilization fading into the whistling wind. The road, if one could call it that, wound upward, cutting through dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The temperature dropped with every mile. Barrett didn't speak. He drove the horses with expert, minimal movements. His silence was suffocating. Lorna stole glances at him. Up close, the scar was even more terrifying. It looked like a claw mark, ragged and deep. What kind of animal had done that? Or worse, what kind of man? "Mr. Coulter?" she ventured after an hour of silence. He didn't look at her. "Barrett." "Barrett?" She tested the name. "The sheriff. He said things back there." Barrett's jaw tightened. The leather reins creaked in his gloved fists. "Brody talks. That's what he does." "He said you were dangerous." Barrett pulled back on the reins as the wagon navigated a sharp switchback. To their right, the cliff dropped away into a dizzying ravine. To their left, a wall of rock. He turned his head slowly, fixing her with that intense stare. "Mountains are dangerous, Miss Lorna. Bears, wolves, cold that freezes a man's blood in a minute. I survive 'em. If that makes me dangerous, then Brody is right." He turned back to the road. "But I don't kill for sport, and I don't hurt what's mine." "What's mine?" The phrase hung in the cold air. It was possessive, archaic, and strangely protective. Or was it a warning of ownership? Lorna couldn't decide. They reached the cabin, just as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the leaden sky. It wasn't the hovel she had feared. It was a substantial structure of hand-hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing protected by a granite ridge. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. There was a barn, a corral, and a stack of firewood that looked like a fortress wall. Barrett brought the wagon to a halt. "Inside. Fire's banked. I'll see to the horses." Lorna climbed down, her legs shaking from the cold and the rough ride. She stepped into the cabin. It was warm. That was her first sensation. The main room was large, dominated by a massive stone hearth. A bearskin rug lay in front of it. There was a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jarred preserves and books. Lorna stepped closer. Shakespeare, Plato, a treatise on botany. She ran a finger over the spines. The beast could read. The door opened with a gust of wind, and Barrett entered, carrying her trunk and 2 crates of supplies. He kicked the door shut behind him. He seemed even larger inside the cabin, his head nearly brushing the timber beams. He set the trunk down at the foot of a narrow staircase. "Loft is yours," he said, shrugging off his heavy coat. Underneath, he wore a simple flannel shirt that strained against the muscles of his back. "I sleep down here." Lorna blinked. "Oh, I assumed." "You assumed I bought a woman for my bed." He turned to face her, his expression hard. "I need help with the trapping lines. I need someone to cure the hides and keep the fire when I'm gone, days at a time. I need a partner, not a whore." The crude word made her blush, but the relief was so profound she nearly wept. "I am not afraid of work," Lorna said softly. "Good." He walked to the stove and lifted a cast-iron pot. "Stew's hot. Eat, then sleep. Storm's hitting hard tonight." That first night, Lorna lay in the loft on a mattress stuffed with straw and lavender. The wind howled outside, battering the cabin like a physical blow. Through the cracks in the floorboards, she could see the glow of the fire below. She watched Barrett. He sat in the rocking chair, staring into the flames. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't cleaning a gun. He was whittling a small piece of wood, his large, scarred hands moving with delicate precision. He looked lonely. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind, a graveyard in his eyes. Suddenly, Barrett stopped. He didn't look up, but his voice drifted up to the loft, quiet and low. "Lock the hatch, Lorna." "What?" she whispered. "There is a latch on the trap door to the loft. Lock it from the inside." "Why?" "So you can sleep," he said simply. "So you know I won't come up." Lorna stared at the trap door. He was giving her the power to shut him out. He was giving her safety against himself. She reached out and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. It clicked loudly in the silence. Down below, Barrett resumed his whittling. Lorna pulled the quilt tight under her chin. She was trapped in the wilderness with a man the world called a monster, a man who had just handed her the key to her own sanctuary. But as she drifted off, she couldn't help but wonder. If the town was so afraid of him, why was the sheriff the one who had made her skin crawl, while the monster had only offered her warm stew and a lock on her door? 2 weeks passed. The snow had piled 5 feet high against the cabin walls, turning the world into a blinding expanse of white. Lorna had fallen into a rhythm, though it was a grueling one. Barrett was a demanding taskmaster, but never cruel. He taught her how to scrape the fat from beaver pelts without tearing the skin. He showed her how to bank the fire so it lasted until dawn. He spoke little, his words rationed like sugar in winter. But Lorna noticed things. She noticed that he always ate after she did. She noticed that when he went out to chop wood, he positioned himself between the wind and the cabin to spare the door the worst of the draft. One morning, the routine shattered. Barrett had left before dawn to check the trap lines on the northern ridge. He usually returned by noon, but noon came and went, and the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Lorna paced the cabin floor. The temperature was dropping fast. If he was caught out there in the dark— "He is a mountain man," she told herself. "He survives." But a gnawing feeling in her gut, an instinct she hadn't known she possessed, told her something was wrong. She looked at the rifle hanging over the mantel. Barrett had shown her how to load it, though he had laughed when the recoil nearly knocked her over. "If I am not back," he had told her once, "you stay inside, no matter what you hear." But at 4 p.m., she heard a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a horse whinnying in panic. Lorna grabbed her heavy wool shawl and threw open the door. The cold hit her like a physical slap. "Barrett!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the vastness. There, at the edge of the clearing, Barrett's horse, Midnight, was stumbling through the drifts. The saddle was empty. Blood was smeared across the horse's flank. Lorna didn't think. She didn't remember the warnings or the cold. She grabbed the rifle and ran toward the horse. The animal was spooked, eyes rolling. "Easy, easy," she soothed, grabbing the reins. She looked back at the trail the horse had broken through the snow. There were drag marks and red spots. She tied the horse to the porch rail and began to walk. She trudged through the knee-deep snow, her breath tearing at her lungs. She followed the trail of blood for a quarter of a mile into the timber. She found him slumped against the base of a massive pine tree. "Barrett!" He was conscious, but barely. His face was grey, his lips blue. A massive gash tore through his thigh, soaking his trousers in dark, freezing blood. A dead cougar lay 10 feet away, its skull crushed, but not before it had mauled him. Lorna dropped to her knees beside him. "Barrett, look at me." His eyes fluttered open. They were hazy. "Go! Back!" he rasped. "Cougar! Mate! Might be close." "I am not leaving you," she snapped, panic making her voice sharp. She looked at the wound. It was deep. He had lost too much blood. He couldn't walk, and he was too heavy for her to carry. "Lorna, shut up," she ordered. "You are not going to die. You promised me safety, you stubborn oaf, and I am holding you to it." She looked around. The terrain was downhill back to the cabin. If she could just get him to slide. She unbuttoned her heavy wool coat. "What? Doing?" "Saving your life." She spread the coat on the snow next to him. "Roll now." "No, you'll freeze. I have a shawl and a corset. I am fine. Roll." She shoved his shoulder. Groaning, a sound of pure agony. Barrett rolled onto the coat. Lorna grabbed the sleeves of the coat and wrapped them around his chest, tying them tight. Then, grabbing the collar, she began to pull. It was impossible. He weighed nearly 300 pounds. But adrenaline is a powerful fuel. She dug her heels into the snow, gritting her teeth until her jaw popped. She dragged him, inch by inch. "I hate you," she grunted, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You heavy beast." Barrett watched her through slitted eyes. He saw the woman who had trembled at the train station, now cursing like a sailor, fighting the mountain itself to save him. It took her an hour to drag him the quarter mile. By the time they reached the porch, Lorna's hands were raw and bleeding inside her gloves. She couldn't lift him up the stairs. She ran to the barn, grabbed the block and tackle he used for hoisting deer, and rigged it to the porch beam. She looped the rope under his arms. "Pull," she whispered to herself. She got him onto the porch, then dragged him into the warmth of the cabin. She didn't stop. She cut the pant leg open. She heated a knife in the fire, remembering what she had read in his books about cauterization. Barrett watched her face as she approached him with the glowing blade. He reached up, his hand trembling, and gripped her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. "Lorna," he whispered. "This will hurt," she sobbed. "I know," he said. "Thank you." She pressed the metal to his leg. He didn't scream. He arched his back, a guttural growl tearing from his throat, and then he passed out. Lorna dropped the knife. She collapsed onto the floor beside him, burying her face in his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She stayed there all night, shivering in her corset, keeping him warm with her own body heat, guarding the monster who had become her only world. The fever took him 3 days. For 72 hours the cabin existed in a twilight state of delirium and steam. Lorna barely slept. She became a creature of function, moving between the stove and the bed, wringing out cool cloths, forcing willow bark tea and broth between Barrett's clenched teeth. The man who had seemed like an invincible titan was reduced to a shivering, murmuring vulnerability. In the throes of infection, the walls he had built around himself crumbled. He didn't toss and turn with violence. He curled inward, shielding himself from invisible blows. "Didn't mean to," he mumbled one night, his hand gripping Lorna's wrist with bruising force, though his eyes were blind with heat. "Tell Brody." "Didn't mean to." Lorna smoothed the hair back from his sweating forehead, her fingers tracing the jagged line of the scar that ran through his eyebrow. "Shh, Barrett. Rest." "He wouldn't stop," Barrett gasped, a tear leaking from the corner of his closed eye, a sight that shattered Lorna's heart more than his blood had. "He wouldn't stop hurting her." Lorna froze. Her? Who was she? Was this the previous bride, or someone else? By the fourth morning, the fever broke. Lorna had fallen asleep in the rocking chair, a rifle across her lap, exhausted. She woke to the sensation of being watched. She jerked awake, gripping the Winchester. Barrett was awake. He was pale, his cheeks hollowed out under the beard, but his eyes were clear. He was propped up on his elbows, staring at her with an intensity that made the air in the cabin feel thin. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. Lorna set the rifle down and stood, smoothing her apron. She tried to summon her Boston composure, but she knew she looked a fright, hair wild, eyes rimmed with dark circles. "I told you. I made a promise." "You dragged me," he said, looking down at his bandaged leg. "I saw the tracks before I passed out. You dragged me a quarter-mile. You are heavy," she said, pouring him a cup of water. "I considered leaving you for the wolves halfway there." Barrett took the cup. His fingers brushed hers. He didn't pull away. A ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, making him look younger, human. "Why?" he asked. "You could have let me die. You could have taken the money in the tin box under the floorboards and gone back to Boston in the spring. No one would have blamed you." Lorna sat on the edge of the bed. "Because you put a lock on my door, Barrett. Because you treat your horses with kindness. And because the monsters are usually the ones wearing the silk suits and the sheriff badges, not the ones living in the woods." Barrett lowered the cup. He looked at the ceiling beams. "The sheriff, Brody. He hates me because of his brother, Caleb Brody." "What happened?" "5 years ago. Caleb was a drunk, mean when he drank. He had a wife, a little Paiute woman named Sarah. He beat her. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew it. Everyone looked away." Barrett's fist clenched the blanket. "I didn't. I came down to trade furs, saw him kicking her in the street. I stepped in." Lorna held her breath. "Caleb pulled a knife. He slashed my face." Barrett touched his scar unconsciously. "I didn't want to kill him. I just hit him. Once. But I'm big, Lorna. And I was angry. He fell, hit his head on the stone trough. Never woke up." "It was self-defense," Lorna whispered. "To the law? Maybe. But Brody, he became sheriff 6 months later. He couldn't hang me. Too many witnesses saw Caleb draw first. So he did worse. He poisoned the town against me. Called me a murderer, a beast. He made sure no merchant would give me a fair price. He made sure I was alone." He looked at her. "Until you?" Lorna reached out and covered his large hand with hers. "You are not alone anymore." The weeks of recovery that followed were a strange, domestic bliss. As Barrett regained his strength, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. It wasn't master and servant, or rescuer and victim. It was a partnership. Lorna read to him from Shakespeare in the evenings while he mended harnesses. He carved her a set of knitting needles from bone. They spoke of everything: her father's failed apothecary, the cruelty of the Boston elites, the way the light hit the peaks at dawn. One evening in late February, as the wind howled outside, Barrett stood without his cane for the first time. He walked over to where Lorna was kneading dough. He stood behind her, his heat radiating against her back. He didn't touch her, but the air crackled. "Lorna," he rumbled. She turned. He was so close. The scent of pine and soap filled her senses. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice unsure. "When the snow melts, will you go?" Lorna looked up into those flint eyes, now warm with an emotion he hadn't dared to name. "Do you want me to go?" "No." The word was immediate, fierce. "I want you to stay, but not as a nurse, and not as a housekeeper." He reached out, his calloused thumb grazing her cheekbone. "I have nothing to offer but this mountain and a bad reputation." "I find I have grown fond of the mountain," she whispered. "And the reputation, well, I prefer a dangerous man who protects me to a gentleman who sells me." Barrett leaned down. He kissed her. It wasn't the ravishing, animalistic kiss the town gossips would have expected. It was slow, reverent, and overwhelmingly tender. But beneath the tenderness, there was the power of the avalanche, a promise of unyielding strength. In that moment, Lorna Hayes ceased to be a mail-order bride. She became the mountain man's heart. And as she melted into his arms, she forgot that spring was coming. She forgot that when the snow melts, the wolves can climb the mountain again. April arrived with a violent beauty. The sun turned fierce, turning the white slopes into rushing rivers of meltwater. The wildflowers, glacier lilies and shooting stars, erupted through the mud. The road to Bitter Creek was open. Barrett was fully healed, though the scar on his leg would act up when the pressure dropped. He was happier than he had ever been. He laughed now, a deep, booming sound that startled the jays in the trees. But he was also vigilant. He spent hours cleaning his Winchester, 1873. He checked the perimeter of their land twice a day. "You are worried," Lorna said one morning, watching him scan the tree line through a brass telescope. "Brody knows I didn't die," Barrett said grimly. He would have seen the smoke from our chimney all winter. He was hoping the cold would finish what the cougar started. Now that the road is clear. "He has no reason to come here, Barrett. We bother no one." Barrett lowered the telescope. "Men like Brody don't need a reason. They need a victim." 2 days later, the dog started barking. Lorna was in the garden she had started, turning the rich, dark soil. Barrett was in the barn. She stood up, shielding her eyes against the sun. 3 riders were coming up the switchback. Lorna felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. She recognized the lead horse, a flashy chestnut mare, and the man riding it. Sheriff Brody. Behind him were 2 men Lorna didn't know. They wore long dusters and low-slung gun belts, hired guns. "Barrett!" Lorna called out, keeping her voice steady. Barrett was already there. He stepped out of the barn, the Winchester cradled casually in the crook of his arm. He moved to stand in front of Lorna, placing his massive body between her and the approaching riders. The riders reined in 10 yards away. Brody smiled, his teeth yellow against the dust on his face. "Well, well," Brody drawled, leaning on his saddle horn. "The beast lives. I lost a bet with the mare. I wagered you'd be frozen solid by January." "Get off my land, Brody," Barrett said. His voice was calm, dead level. "Is that any way to greet the law?" Brody tisked. He looked at Lorna, his eyes undressing her in a way that made her skin crawl. And the little bride. "You look healthy, Mrs. Coulter. Mountain air agrees with you. Or maybe it's the company." "State your business," Barrett commanded, his finger drifting to the trigger guard. "Official business, I'm afraid." Brody reached into his coat pocket. The 2 deputies behind him shifted, hands hovering near their holsters. Brody pulled out a folded piece of paper. "We got a telegram from Boston. Seems there's a warrant out for a Miss Lorna Hayes." Lorna's heart stopped as she grabbed the back of Barrett's shirt. "Theft," Brody read, pretending to study the paper. "Grand larceny. Seems she stole a diamond brooch from a Mr. Rupert Grimsby before she fled. A valuable family heirloom." "That is a lie," Lorna shouted, stepping out from behind Barrett. "Rupert Grimsby is a loan shark. I stole nothing. I ran to escape him." Brody shrugged. "I don't judge, sweetheart. I just execute the law. The telegram says to detain you and hold you for a federal marshal coming from Helena. Or," he paused, a cruel glint in his eye, "if Mr. Grimsby gets his property back, or the equivalent value, the charges might be dropped." Barrett didn't look at Lorna. He kept his eyes locked on Brody. "How much?" $5,000, Brody said smoothly. It was an astronomical sum, a fortune. "We don't have that kind of money," Lorna cried. "And you know it." "Do I?" Brody looked at Barrett, See, that's the funny thing, Barrett. My brother Caleb, before you murdered him, he told me you found something up here. Before he died, he said you found a vein of quartz in the North Ridge. Gold quartz. Barrett's expression didn't flicker, but Lorna felt his back muscles tense like steel cables. There is no gold, Barrett said. I think there is, Brody countered. I think you've been sitting on it for 5 years, hoarding it. So here's the deal. You show me the mine. You sign the claim over to me, and the telegram about your pretty little wife goes into the fire. She stays free. And if I refuse? Brody signaled to the men behind him. They drew their revolvers. Then I arrest her for larceny, and I arrest you for resisting an officer. And maybe on the ride back to town, the horses get spooked. Maybe there's an accident, a tragic fall down the ravine for both of you. The threat was naked. Violence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lorna looked at the deputies. They were smiling. They wanted a fight. They wanted an excuse to kill the monster. Barrett shifted his weight. You want the gold, Brody? I want what's mine, Brody hissed. It's not yours, Barrett said softly. But I'll take you to the ridge, alone. Leave her here. No, Lorna grabbed his arm. Barrett, no, he will kill you up there. Brody laughed. Sentimental, I like it. All right, Coulter, we go. But my boys here, they stay with her, just to make sure you don't try anything funny on the trail. Barrett went still. He looked at the 2 deputies, men with cruel mouths and dead eyes. He looked at Lorna. No, Barrett said. The word was final. She comes with us. Brody frowned. That wasn't the deal. It is now. Barrett raised the Winchester slightly. The barrel pointed squarely at Brody's chest. She stays where I can see her, or we can finish this right here. You might get me, Brody. But my first bullet is going through your heart. Are you ready to die for gold you haven't seen yet? The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Brody looked at the dark bore of the rifle. He saw the certainty in Barrett's eyes. He saw the graveyard. Fine, Brody spat. She comes. Saddle up, Coulter. Let's go for a ride. Barrett turned to Lorna. His eyes were urgent. Get your coat, he whispered. And the Colt. Barrett, she whispered back, tears stinging her eyes. Is there really gold? Barrett looked past her, toward the jagged peaks of the North Ridge, a place he had forbidden her to go all winter. Yes, he said quietly. But that's not what I'm going to show them. He squeezed her hand. A goodbye, and a promise all in one. He walked toward the barn to saddle Midnight. Lorna ran into the house. She grabbed her coat. She grabbed the heavy Colt revolver Barrett had taught her to shoot. She shoved it into her deep pocket. She didn't know what Barrett was planning, but she knew one thing. They were riding into a trap, and the only way out was to be more dangerous than the men hunting at them. As they rode out of the clearing, leaving the safety of the cabin behind, Lorna looked at Barrett's broad back. He sat tall in the saddle, the mountain wind whipping his coat. He looked like part of the landscape, unmovable, eternal. Only if you hurt her. The words echoed in her mind. Brody had made a mistake. He thought he was robbing a miner. He didn't realize he was threatening a wolf's mate. The ascent to the North Ridge was not merely a journey. It was a slow, agonizing climb into the throat of the sky. The path Barrett chose was an ancient game trail, barely a scratch against the granite face of the mountain, winding higher into the clouds, where the air grew thin and tasted of copper and ice. Lorna rode behind Barrett, her hands gripping the pommel of her saddle until her fingers ached. Behind her, the heavy breathing of the deputies' horses and the creak of leather were constant reminders of the death that trailed them. Sheriff Brody rode at the rear, a vulture waiting for the carcass to drop. They had been riding for 3 hours. The timberline had fallen away below them, leaving them exposed on a landscape of grey slate and blinding patches of snow that had refused to melt. "How much further, Coulter?" Brody shouted against the wind. The sheriff's voice was thin here, stripped of its town authority by the sheer scale of the wilderness. Barrett halted Midnight on a narrow shelf of rock. He turned in the saddle, his face impassive. Past the Devil's Spire, another hour, unless your horses blow a lung." "My horse is fine," one of the deputies, a man Brody called Dutch, sneered. He patted the neck of his roan mare. "Just show us the colour, mountain man." Lorna looked at Barrett. He wasn't looking at Dutch. He was looking at the snowpack hanging precariously on the cliffs above them. The afternoon sun was hitting it directly. The thaw was dangerous. Barrett knew that. Every loud noise, every vibration was a gamble. "He is leading them into a slaughter," Lorna realized with a jolt of cold terror that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And he is bringing us right along with them." She nudged her horse closer to his. "Barrett," she whispered, the wind snatching her words. "The snow." "Keep your eyes on the trail, Lorna," he murmured, his voice low and vibrating through the air. "When I stop, you get off the horse, immediately. Do not hesitate." "Why?" "Because a horse cannot hide in a crack in the rock. You can." The cryptic warning settled in her stomach like lead. They pressed on. The trail narrowed. On their left, the mountain rose vertically, a wall of loose shale. On their right, a drop of 2,000 feet into the mist-shrouded valley below. One misstep, one loose stone, and a rider would be nothing but a memory before they hit the bottom. Brody moved up, squeezing his horse dangerously close to Lorna's flank to shout at Barrett. "You're quiet, Coulter. Thinking about how you're going to spend your share? Or are you thinking about how soft your wife is going to be when we get back to town?" Brody grinned, a rictus of greed and lust. "I might keep her in the jailhouse for a few days, for questioning." Lorna felt the heat of the Colt revolver in her pocket. She imagined turning, aiming and firing, but she knew the deputies behind her would cut her down before she could cock the hammer. Barrett didn't take the bait. He didn't even look back. But Lorna saw his shoulders rise and fall in a deep, controlled breath. He was gathering himself. He was the coiled spring. They rounded a sharp bend, the wind hitting them with the force of a physical blow. Ahead, the trail widened into a small, bowl-shaped amphitheater of rock, backed by a sheer cliff face. In the center of the cliff, a dark fissure opened like a wound. "There," Barrett said, pulling Midnight to a halt. "The lost Dutchman's vein. It runs deep into the fissure." Brody's eyes went wide. Greed, naked and ugly, washed over his face. He spurred his horse forward, pushing past Lorna, nearly knocking her mount off the ledge. "Dutch! Slim! Watch them!" Brody yelled, dismounting while his horse was still moving. He scrambled toward the dark opening in the rock. "If this is it, if this is real—" Dutch and the other deputy, Slim, drew their guns, training them on Barrett and Lorna. "Get down," Slim ordered, waving his revolver. "Hands where we can see 'em." Barrett dismounted slowly. He moved with a deliberate sluggishness, playing the defeated man. He reached up and helped Lorna down. As his hands gripped her waist, he squeezed tight. Once, twice. A signal. "It looks like a wolf den." Dutch laughed, eyeing the dark cave. "You sure there's gold in there, or just bat guano?" "Go look," Barrett said. "The quartz vein is on the back wall. You need a lantern to see the sparkle." Brody was already at the mouth of the cave, striking a match to light a torch he had brought. "Get in here, Coulter. You go first. I ain't walking into a bear hug." Barrett looked at Lorna. "Stay here." "No," Brody barked. "She comes too. Everyone goes in. We don't leave loose ends outside." Barrett's jaw tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. He had wanted Lorna outside, near the rock shelter. "She stays," Barrett said, his voice dropping to that dangerous rumble. "Or I don't show you the vein. You can shoot me, Brody, but you'll never find the vein in that maze without me. You'll die in the dark." Brody hesitated. He looked at the cave, then at the gold fever burning in his brain. He looked at the darkening sky. He was impatient. "Fine," Brody spat. "Slim, you stay with the girl. Keep a gun to her head. If you hear a gunshot inside, that isn't mine. You blow her brains out." Slim grinned, revealing a gap in his front teeth. "With pleasure, Sheriff." Barrett turned to Lorna. He didn't kiss her. He didn't say, "I love you." He simply looked at her with those flint eyes, telegraphing a message of brutal intent. Be ready." Then he turned and walked into the darkness, followed by Brody and Dutch. Lorna stood alone on the windy ledge with Slim. He holstered his gun, but kept his hand on the grip, leaning against a boulder, watching her with a lazy, arrogant stare. "Pretty thing like you," Slim muttered, spitting tobacco juice onto the pristine snow. "Shame. Sheriff's gonna use you up. Maybe if you're nice to me, I'll let you go quick." Lorna didn't answer. She was watching the horses. They were ears back, nervous. She was watching the snowpack high above the cave entrance, and she was fingering the cold steel of the Colt in her pocket, flipping the safety latch off with her thumb. Barrett was in the dark with 2 killers, but she was in the light with 1, and the mountain was listening. Inside the fissure, the air was stagnant and cold, smelling of ancient dust and sulphur. The torch in Brody's hand cast dancing, grotesque shadows against the wet limestone walls. Barrett walked in the lead. He walked with his head slightly bowed, mindful of the low ceiling. He counted his steps. 12, 13. The drop is at 20. "I don't see no gold, Coulter," Dutch grumbled from behind, the click of his revolver hammer echoing loudly in the confined space. "Deeper," Barrett said. "The vein runs vertical." They reached a point where the floor of the cave sloped sharply downward. To the untrained eye, it looked like a continuation of the path. To Barrett, who had explored these caves 3 years ago to rescue a trapped wolf pup, it was the edge of a subterranean chasm, a fault line that dropped 400 feet into the bowels of the mountain. "Hold the light up," Barrett ordered, stopping just 2 feet from the invisible edge. Brody stepped forward, thrusting the torch high. The light flared, illuminating the walls. "There," Barrett pointed to a streak of mica and pyrite, fool's gold, embedded in the rock wall across the chasm. It glittered seductively in the torchlight. "Mother of God," Brody whispered. "Look at that sparkle, it's thick as my arm." "It's rich," Barrett lied, "but you have to cross to get it." "Cross what?" Brody looked down. The torchlight didn't reach the bottom of the blackness in front of them. "There's a ledge," Barrett said. "Narrow. I've walked it 100 times. Brody peered into the abyss. He was trembling with avarice. He turned to Dutch. "Go check it out." "Me? Why me?" "Because I'm the sheriff, and I said so." Brody's voice rose to a shout, echoing violently off the cavern walls. Crack! The sound came from above them, deep in the rock structure, not from the shout itself, but from the vibration disturbing something ancient. Barrett didn't wait. He spun around. In the tight confines, his size was a weapon. He didn't punch. He slammed his shoulder into Dutch's chest like a battering ram. Dutch grunted, the air leaving his lungs in a whoosh. He flew backward, his boots skidding on the slick stone. He flailed, trying to catch his balance, but he was too close to the edge. With a scream that was cut short by the swallowing dark, Dutch vanished into the chasm. Brody roared, swinging the torch like a club. Fire streaked through the air. Barrett ducked, the flames singing his bare fur coat. He lunged for Brody's gun hand. They grappled. Brody was smaller, but he was wiry and desperate, fueled by the adrenaline of greed and fear. He fired the gun. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the cave. The bullet sparked off the stone wall inches from Barrett's ear, sending stone fragments into his skin. Outside on the ledge, Lorna heard the muffled boom. Slim heard it too. He grinned. "Sounds like your husband just had an accident." He took a step toward her, reaching for his holster. Lorna didn't think about mercy. She didn't think about being a lady from Boston. She thought about the man who had carried her through the snow. She pulled the heavy Colt from her pocket. It was too heavy for one hand, so she used two. She didn't aim for the head or the heart. She aimed for the biggest part of him. She pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly broke her wrists. The bullet hit Slim in the stomach, knocking him backward into the dirt. He stared at her, shock replacing the arrogance in his eyes, clutching his belly. Lorna didn't wait to see if he was dead. She scrambled toward the rock shelter Barrett had pointed out, a small overhang of granite protected from the cliffs above. Inside the cave, the gunshot had done what the shout had not. The ceiling groaned. Dust began to rain down. The mountain was waking up. Barrett had Brody by the throat, pinning him against the wall. Brody dropped the torch. It sputtered on the damp floor. "You want the gold?" Barrett roared, his face inches from the sheriff's. "Take it. It's all down there with Dutch." "I'll kill you," Brody gargled, clawing at Barrett's eyes. "You killed Sarah." Barrett slammed Brody's head against the rock. "You killed my peace, but you won't kill her." The ceiling cracked with the sound of a cannon shot. A boulder the size of an anvil crashed down, obliterating the path where they had stood seconds ago. Barrett realized the whole entrance was collapsing. He had to move. He released Brody. "Rot in hell, Brody!" Barrett turned and ran. He sprinted toward the daylight, dodging falling debris. Brody, dazed and bleeding, saw the exit. He scrambled after Barrett, screaming, "Wait! Wait!" Barrett burst out of the cave mouth into the blinding afternoon sun. "Lorna!" he bellowed. "Here!" She screamed from the rock shelter. Barrett dove toward her, throwing his body over hers just as the world ended. The gunshot inside the cave, combined with the unstable spring thaw, triggered the snowpack above. It started as a hiss, then a rumble, and then a roar that drowned out all thought. Thousands of tons of white death cascaded down the cliff face. It swept over the cave entrance. It swept over the ledge where Slim lay bleeding. It swept over the horses. Barrett curled around Lorna, pressing her into the back of the shallow overhang. He was a shield of flesh and bone against the fury of nature. The noise was apocalyptic. The earth shook. Darkness fell as the snow buried them. And then, silence. A silence so profound it hurt the ears. Lorna lay curled in a ball, Barrett's heavy weight pressing her down. It was pitch black. "Barrett," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am here." His voice rumbled against her back. "I'm here." He shifted. He pushed upward. The snow was packed tight, but they were in the pocket of air created by the overhang. He braced his massive shoulders against the snow wall, blocking them in, and shoved. It didn't move. "Are we buried?" Lorna asked, fighting the rising panic. "Yes, but not deep. The overhang saved us." Barrett began to dig. He dug with his hands, clawing at the packed ice. Lorna helped, her fingernails breaking, her hands freezing. They dug for what felt like hours, though it might have been minutes. Suddenly, a beam of light pierced the darkness. A hand broke through. The air rushed in, sweet and cold. Barrett widened the hole and pushed his way out, dragging Lorna with him. They emerged onto a transformed landscape. The ledge was gone. The trail was gone. The cave mouth was completely sealed under 50 feet of rock and snow. Sheriff Brody, Deputy Dutch, Deputy Slim, and the horses were gone. Buried under the white tomb of the avalanche, the mountain had cleaned the slate. Lorna stood shivering, looking at the devastation. She looked at Barrett. He was covered in white dust, his face bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his coat torn. He looked at the sealed mountain. "Is it over?" she asked. Barrett put his arm around her, pulling her into his side. "The gold is gone. The men who wanted it are gone. The warrant died with Brody." He looked down at her. "You shot that man." "He was going to kill you," Lorna said, her chin lifting. "I told you. I am dangerous too." Barrett threw his head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened relief that echoed across the valleys. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the snow. "Let's go home, Mrs. Coulter," he said. "It's a long walk." 3 years later, the cabin had changed. A new room had been added to the east side, catching the morning sun. The garden was twice the size now, surrounded by a sturdy fence to keep the deer out. Lorna sat on the porch, a basket of beans in her lap. She was snapping them, the rhythmic snap-snap sound merging with the buzzing of the bees. She looked different. Her skin was tanned by the high-altitude sun. Her arms were toned from work. She no longer wore the grey dresses of a Boston spinster. She wore a simple calico skirt and one of Barrett's flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up. A squeal of laughter erupted from the barn. A toddler, barely 2 years old, came toddling out into the sunlight. He had a mop of unruly dark hair and eyes the colour of flint. He was chasing a golden retriever puppy. "Thomas!" Lorna called out. "Stay away from the horse's hooves." "He's fine, Lyd." Barrett walked out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved a little slower now. The leg bothered him when it rained, but he was still the mountain, solid and immovable. He scooped the boy up in one arm, tossing him into the air until the child shrieked with delight. Barrett walked up the porch steps. He set the boy down, who immediately ran to harass the puppy again. Barrett sat on the railing near Lorna. He reached out and took a bean from her basket, snapping it clumsily with his large fingers. "Town's growing," he said. "New sheriff seems honest. Asked me if I'd guide a survey team next month. Did you say yes?" "Told him I'd have to ask my boss." He winked at her. Lorna smiled, leaning her head against his thigh. "We could use the money. The roof needs tar." "We don't need the money," Barrett said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured the contents into Lorna's palm. It wasn't a nugget, it was a ring. A band of rough, hammered gold, set with a small, unpolished piece of quartz that glittered with a singular, fierce light. "I went back," he said, "to the ridge. Found a piece of the float rock in the stream below the slide. I hammered it out myself." Lorna stared at the ring. It was made from the gold that had killed 3 men. But in Barrett's hands, it had been purified. It wasn't greed anymore. It was a gift. "I never gave you a proper ring," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never gave you a proper courtship." Lorna slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "You gave me my life, Barrett," she said, looking up at him. "You gave me the sky." Barrett leaned down and kissed her. It was the kiss of a man who had faced the devil and won. The town of Bitter Creek still told stories about the beast of the bighorns. They said he was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance who brought down the mountain on his enemies. They warned travelers not to go up the North Ridge. But Lorna knew the truth. The beast was gone. In his place was a man, a father, and a husband. He was dangerous, yes, but only if you hurt her. Lorna and Barrett's story reminds us that sometimes the monsters we fear are the only ones capable of saving us, and the true villains often wear the mask of civility. From a terrifying arrangement to a bond forged in the blood and snow, they proved that love isn't just about soft words. It's about standing between your partner and the avalanche. If you enjoyed this dramatic saga of the Wild West, please hit that like button. It helps the channel immensely. Don't forget to share this video with fellow romance lovers and subscribe for more epic stories of love, survival, and justice. What would you have done in Lorna's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.